I was asked a question on the E Type forum about how I weld up small holes in the body, and I indicated I use a combination of MIG, TIG, depending on the size of the hole. Now, I've shown in some of my videos how I use TIG in welding up holes about this size here. These are drilled out and I fill them with metal discs and then TIG them into place. Smaller holes, I have the option of either using TIG or MIG. Mostly I use MIG, and when trying to fill the holes I make sure that the hole is not surrounded by rust, so I might drill it out a little bit more. Once I'm satisfied it's all metal, then what I do is I put some backing plates behind just to make sure I don't, when I'm using MIG, and I would tend to use MIG for that, just so I don't blow basically all of the hole out. So what you can do if you're not careful is you're trying to fill the hole and with MIG, and all of a sudden it chops a piece out the side and the hole gets bigger and bigger. To avoid that, I use a combination of things. Where possible I use copper, and this is just a thin copper sheet. What is it? It's 0.8. Just bought it on eBay, just a roll of it, and I cut it to different lengths depending on what I'm using it for. I also use this for TIG when I'm welding panels together. It's nice and light, doesn't absorb the heat too much. If I'm using MIG, I might use this thicker piece of copper. If I'm filling a hole, just put that behind and then use the MIG to fill that. But I also use aluminium. These are just old scraps that I've got lying around, and they're very handy to get into the places that are in a bit. I can push it in, I can clamp it, and then it's got a nice surface behind. MIG of course doesn't stick to this. You can see the scorch marks, and that's all it does, and it works quite well. As I say, very handy to get into some awkward places, so you can push it in behind a panel rather than trying to get a very large piece of copper, because it has to be fairly rigid to do that. This thin stuff, of course, you've got to hold it to the inside of the panel. I use sometimes vice grips, and in other occasions I'll use these rare earth magnets, which are hard to get apart, but they'll just stick on there and just holds it to the panel. When I put these on, of course, I make sure that the magnet's not too close to the weld. I have had problems, particularly with TIG, where the magnet's too close to the weld and it affects the arc. So, but anyway, you can put these at either end of a strip, well away from the weld, and that works well. The other thing I mentioned is that before I'd weld a hole, in fact before I weld anything, I always test the settings on scrap pieces of metal. That's what this was. I was doing some plug welds, and although I know the settings from what I've done previously, I quite often find that those settings don't always work, and when you're setting up the MIG for the day, I always test it on a piece of scrap. In this case I was plug welding, so I was trying different settings to see how much penetration I could get. The other thing, and this is something I didn't mention on the E Type forum, is that when I use the test piece, in particular with this test piece here, I was welding down and trying different settings and getting the right one with the most penetration, and that's fine. It ends up, it gives you a rate of feed and an amperage to use. But if this weld is what I'll call vertical, up like that, the setting will be different. So what I always do is that when I'm doing the test piece, I angle the test piece the same angle that I'm going to weld, and then do the setting. So in the case of this, that was fine for a flat weld, but the rate of feed wasn't good enough for a vertical weld. I actually had to increase the rate of feed. So just something to be very careful of. But it's a lot easier to use a test piece. If you make a mess of that, doesn't matter. There's plenty of scrap metal lying around here. And I always use these bits of scrap to simulate what I'm going to do. If I was going to do a seam weld, I'd do the same. Just 2 bits of scrap, put them together and test the setting for the seam weld. Once again, whether it's a vertical weld or a flat weld. Anyway, I thought I'd elaborate on what I do. Other people do different things. You can buy special plates, I understand, which would make it easier, I suppose. But for me, a lot easier to either use scraps lying around the yard or buy a little bit of copper. It's not that expensive, and as you can see, I haven't used that much of it. I might have one other piece I've cut off a little bit longer than that. I was doing a long TIG weld, but so you use these. Oh, and the other thing to be careful of too is that when you're using a backing plate behind, they act as a heat sink. This in particular will draw the heat out of the weld, so you'll find that the setting will be different again. This of course doesn't absorb all that much heat, but even then with a TIG, I notice the difference when I put a metal plate, copper plate behind, and the TIG setting has to change to suit. So just another thing to be wary of. But the moral of the story is practice on a piece that doesn't matter before you work on the car where it actually does matter. I'm just going around the car to make sure, of the rear of the car, make sure I've got all the dents out as much as I can. As I've said previously, this area was damaged because of the bumper bar, and it's pushed things in a little bit. I've outlined a dent that I'm going to work on here. It's not it's quite large, but it's not that deep. I can get in behind it, and the reason for that is that I pulled the plate out from underneath, which I also had to repair. In fact, no, this side is actually a new piece I fabricated. So before I weld this back in underneath, I'll just work on this a bit more and get as much out as I can. Now I may not be able to get it all out, but I'll certainly get most of it out, and I'll then use a little bit of filler to fill it up. On this other side here, you can just see that in the camera, this is where I filled up the dent puller holes. So that's been panel beaded out, and there's just a slight imperfection around the welds that I've got to fill, so that will be a little skim of, I'll use fiberglass filler on these to just skim over the top. Other than that, the dents on the rear, on the outer panel, have been rectified, but I'll just go over it once again with a sanding block to make sure I've got the bulk of it out, and then I'll proceed to weld these bottom plates underneath. These are where the actual bumper bar mounts on. So I've got to do those. So it will weld up under there. That's what I did. If I haven't trimmed it, I'll do that before I weld it on. So, and I haven't put any plug weld holes, so I don't have a spot welder, so I'll plug weld this. So it shouldn't be that difficult. Now I've finished panel beating this section here out. That's quite straight. A few little ripples that I can't get out, but there are also some plug weld holes there, so that's causing some of that. Little bit of filler, that'll be fine, but majority of it is out, so that's good. I've also put a coating of zinc-rich gel in the panel itself. I've tried to spray it up under there as well and right down in the crevices there. And also I've done the inside of these panels after weld on the top and put some weld through primer on the areas that I've got to weld. So areas across there and across here. So what I'll be doing next is to tack screw these panels in place, ready for welding. But before I weld, I'll drop the boot floor in just to make sure everything is still in alignment before I finalise the welding of this. So it'd be good to get this all welded up. It's a fair bit of welding to do, but as long as I'm careful, it should all go quite well. I've just dropped the boot floor into position and everything aligns the way it should be, so that's good. Tack screw these plates into place, ready to weld, but I've noticed just got a couple of plug welds to drill on the back flange there and on the inside, because some of the plug welds will come in from the rear. I've got another one somewhere in here, so I'll just pull all this apart, make those new plug weld holes and put it back together, and then I'll start welding these pieces into place. I've finished welding these pieces in. The welds have just been roughly ground off. I'm not too sure whether I'll do much more on that, perhaps a little bit, but this is underneath and it's actually behind the tail light. Put it over here. Tail light goes in here. So none of this in here can be really seen. That's under the bumper bar. This is behind the tail light and so on. But I still may just clean them up a little bit more. I still got a few things to do. There's a mount that I took off for the rear light surround. So these have got to be welded back in here. They're bent a little bit out of shape, but so there's not much to do on this side. The one on the other side, of course, is I'm going to have to repair that. I'll weld a new flange on the bottom of that, and it's also bent out of shape. So I've got those to do. Also, I've got the captive nuts to put back in here. Now I had to take them out because of the panel damage there. So I've just got to weld them back in. So I've got to do that. I've got to do these brackets. Now these brackets and that, of course, a lot easier to do if I don't have the boot floor in. So this should be the last welding I've got to do on the rear end before I start to address putting the boot floor back in place. So it's getting closer, everything's getting nice and tight. It's quite solid in the back, it's got its shape back in it, so I'm quite pleased with the way it's gone. But just a little bit more to do on this before I can start to address the floor in here. Now these are the captive nuts from the tail light. Got to clean them up. One of them was okay. The other one had a sheared off thread in there. So what I'm doing, I'm trying something that Chuck at Monocoque Metalworks showed on one of his videos, and it was how to get little sheared pieces out of captive nuts. And what he did was to drop a bit of MIG weld onto the broken shaft. Now this was sheared off pretty well close to the surface of the nut, but I put more than one. I lowered the amperage a bit on the MIG and just filled up enough to be able to grab onto. Now this has cooled off a bit. It's better if I kept going when I started to try and undo the thread, but hopefully it'll keep coming. It did move when it was hot, but I've let it cool off just to set the camera up. So the theory is this should come off. So the MIG sticks onto the broken shaft of the bolt or whatever went through the cert nut, and when you put the MIG spot on there, it applies heat, which also helps loosen the thread. Now it was starting to loosen before, and hopefully, yes, it's still going. Hopefully this will come out and I'll be left with an intact thread. I mean, the alternative is that you replace the nut, or you try and drill it out, and that never goes well, or certainly not for me. But this seems to be working marvellous. It will come out, hopefully. Just a bit. I'll need to run a tap through this too. I'll certainly do that before I go too much further, but there it is. Whoop. Whether you can see that, it's hard to see. So there it is. There's the Weld on top. Threads just come out, which is good. And now I have a reusable captive nut. Good as new. Obviously, if this had been left in the car, I pulled these off so I could do some panel beating, but it still works the same. You just position it, drop your weld on the end where it's sheared off, and then hopefully it'll come undone. And that way you don't have to worry about then trying to drill it out or replace the captive nut on the car. So it does work, works well. I'm pleased I saw what Chuck showed on his video. Anyway, I'll clean these up and then I'll weld those back into place and keep going on with welding these brackets in. And as I say, I've got to repair that one and straighten it out a bit. It's all bent. Now I've put the bumper bars back up because I'm trying to finalise the position for the brackets that hold the tail light in, and I want to make sure everything clears. So when I started to put this on, which goes on about there and there, I realised that this bracket is also slightly bent out of shape, so I've got to correct that. So that's the first thing. The other thing I'm looking for is the correct clearance between the light and the bar. So I'm checking that as well, making sure that everything is right there. And apart from that, when I've been doing that, I've actually found that I've still got a problem with this mount on this side. This is where the main damage was from the slight bump in the rear. Now, I thought I had the bracket in the right place, but it turns out it's still not quite right. So what I've done, and I guess it's a bit drastic, I've actually cut this bracket off the bumper bar. So what I'm going to do, instead of trying to bend it around and get it back in the right shape, I'm going to position the bumper bar into its final position, which is going to take a little bit of time to sort around with that. And then I'm just going to tack weld the bracket back into place. That way it'll be sitting at the correct angle. So what I've got to do now is to make sure I've got this bumper bar in the correct position. Now, bearing in mind I still don't have the bolt hole in the wheel arch here. I haven't got that, so I want to take some measurements to make sure I've got this bumper bar the correct amount forward, not too far forward of course, and to make sure also I've got this at the rear end here, that I've got the bar high enough when the bracket is tacked in place. Now I'm not going to do a final weld in any event, I'm just going to do a few tacks, so if I need to remove it, it's easier to remove. I won't do a final weld on the bracket until I've got all this rear end in place, so still give me a bit of room for flexibility, but initially I'll try and set it based on what I've got here at the moment, making sure the clearances are right here for the tail light, also making sure I've got enough room for the centre piece of the bar and that it all lines up with the bracket, so I've got to make sure that's all right. But as I say, when I put this on, this bracket still wasn't quite right, and it was really because it was, I can get that off, it was bent down in the bottom here. I thought when I heated it up I got most of that bent out, but I haven't, so it wasn't sitting square on the panel here, it was cocked up on one side. So this way I know the bracket is sitting flat on the panel, and the key to it is getting the correct height for this, so that's going to take a little bit of time to sort out, but I'm confident I can do it, and just it's worth spending the time now to get it right. And then once I've got that in the correct position, then I'll work on this bracket and weld this. The bracket's holding this tail light scoop in place. Now I've put a temporary fix on the mount on the bumper bar here, and I've put the whole bar on. It's not a final fit, because I've got to do the gaps around the body, and they're at the moment all over the place, which from what I've read, is to be expected. They never really fitted very well, and some say they relied on the sealing rubber between the bar and the body to cover up the uneven gaps. But I won't be adjusting those gaps until probably till I'm almost finished the body here. But at this stage the bar is in the right position. I've just been putting the tail light in position so I can weld this bracket in. It appears to be pretty close to the right shape now. And I've taken some measurements, everything's quite level. So what I'll be doing is just carefully taking this off and tack screwing the bracket in so I can weld it into place. The rear end has finally been welded up. Got the brackets in place, the cert nuts have been put back in, and I've made sure that the tail light surrounds actually match up with all the holes. So that took a bit, little bit more panel beating on the panels to ensure that was right. So I now know that everything will fit. So all this back end is complete. The panel work is done, repairs are done, and now I'm going to drop the floor in and just recheck that, and rechecking it with a view to actually welding it in place. So it's the last major panel to go into position. Now the general fit of the boot is not too bad, but I've still got to tweak it a little bit. It's probably got a little bit of damage in transport. I'll assume that anyway. The panel is actually not completely flat across there. It's got a bit of a dip in the middle, so I've got to get that out. The curve around here is not quite right. It's maybe it's partly due to that. I'll fix that first and see how this sits. This seems to bow up here a little bit too much, and it's probably needs to go just a small fraction further to the rear. Now maybe if this extra bow in here is dropped down, that will tend to push that out. So as I say, it's very close. I've already tweaked some of the things up in here to get them to fit when I did the initial fit some time ago, but this is the final fit before welding, so I've got a chance to just refine it a bit more. So hopefully it'll work out fine. But so I'll start with this dish in the rear end. I can feel it a bit wavy across there. Now it could also be when these reinforcing pieces were welded in too, and it's reasonably wavy across there. It's certainly not flat. I may not be able to get it flat across there, but I'll certainly aim to get it flat across there so I can push it up easier against the flange for welding. So anyway, it's a bit of work to do before I weld it in, but it's at least progressing in the right direction.